Life in a kitchen is a symphony of chaos and order, a relentless grind that leaves little room for contemplation. For most of my adult life, I was one of those figures behind the swinging doors of restaurants, an unremarkable but essential cog in the machine. Born in a small industrial town to a family that valued sweat over dreams, my path seemed set from the start. I had tried to escape it once, a fleeting attempt at college, but the weight of my family's financial struggles brought me back to the frying pans and stainless steel countertops. By the time I was 35, I had become a veteran of the trade. I had worked in every corner of the kitchen: dishwasher, prep cook, line cook, and eventually sous chef. But even the title of sous chef came without ceremony. It wasn't a badge of honor, but a testament to my endurance. The hours were grueling, often stretching into 12-hour shifts that left my legs aching and my mind numbed. I clocked in 280 hours a month, sometimes more. It was the kind of job where the pay barely covered rent, groceries, and the occasional repair for my beat-up car. Overtime wasn't a bonus, it was a necessity. My life outside the kitchen was just as unremarkable. I lived alone in a tiny studio apartment with peeling paint and a leaking faucet. The kitchen's perpetual hum followed me home. The sound of a fridge struggling against its expiration date, the clatter of pots replaying in my head like a ghostly echo. I had no hobbies to speak of, no close friends, and certainly no romantic prospects. My days off were spent catching up on sleep, nursing the blisters on my hands, or occasionally treating myself to a cheap takeout meal. A small irony for a man who spent his life cooking for others. Yet, in this bleak monotony, I found a peculiar sense of purpose. The kitchen, for all its flaws, was the one place where I felt I belonged. The routines, the orders barked out by the head chef, the rush of service, these were the constants in my life. I knew the kitchen's rhythms as intimately as a musician knows their instrument. There was a strange comfort in the predictability of it all, even if it was suffocating. My coworkers were a motley crew, each with their own baggage. There was Carlos, the line cook who always had a story about his glory days in a band that never quite made it. Linda, the pastry chef, spoke of retiring to a cottage by the sea, but never seemed to take a step toward that dream. And then there was Tony, the head chef, a tyrant with a temper who took sadistic pleasure in berating his staff. I endured Tony's tirades with quiet resignation, knowing that quitting wasn't an option. This was my life, and I had accepted it. The town I lived in wasn't much different from my workplace. It was a place where ambition went to die, where people worked long hours in factories, shops, or kitchens like mine. The streets were lined with bars and liquor stores, and the only signs of life after dark came from the flickering neon lights advertising cheap beer and karaoke nights. I often found myself walking those streets after my shifts, the smell of grease clinging to my clothes. I'd stop by a bar, order a drink, and watch the world pass me by. It wasn't much of a life, but it was mine. Beneath my stoic exterior, however, there was a restlessness I couldn't quite shake. I'd catch myself staring out the kitchen's tiny window, wondering if there was more to life than this. But those thoughts were fleeting, quickly drowned out by the clang of pots and the hiss of frying oil. Ambition was a luxury I couldn't afford. I'd seen others try to climb out of this life, only to fall harder. The risks seemed too great, the rewards too distant. The days blurred together in an endless cycle of orders and exhaustion. My alarm clock would jolt me awake at 6 a.m., its shrill beep echoing in the silence of my apartment. I'd drag myself out of bed, my body protesting with every movement. The walk to the restaurant was a brief reprieve, the crisp morning air a rare moment of clarity before the chaos began. By 7 a.m., I was in the kitchen, tying my stained apron and setting up my station. The next 12 hours were a whirlwind of activity, chopping vegetables, marinating meats, assembling dishes with assembly line precision. There was no room for error. A single mistake could throw off the entire operation. The heat from the stoves was oppressive, the noise relentless. Orders came in waves, each one bringing its own set of challenges. By the time my shift ended, I felt like I had been wrung dry. Despite the grueling hours, the pay was barely enough to keep me afloat. The restaurant industry was notorious for its low wages, and my situation was no exception. I often wondered how I'd managed to survive this long, but I knew the answer: sheer willpower. I had grown accustomed to the grind, my body adapting to the demands of the job like a soldier in the trenches. But the physical toll was only part of the story. The mental strain was just as debilitating. My thoughts were consumed by the never-ending cycle of work and bills. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt truly happy or excited about anything. My world had shrunk to the confines of the kitchen in my dingy apartment, with no room for dreams or aspirations. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of another life. I'd overhear customers talking about their vacations, their promotions, their plans for the future. It was a world I couldn't comprehend, a world where people had choices and opportunities. I envied them, but I also resented them. They didn't know what it was like to work 280 hours a month just to scrape by. They didn't know what it was like to be invisible. Still, I pressed on. I didn't know any other way. The kitchen was my life, my identity. It was the only thing I was good at, the only thing that gave me a sense of purpose. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was meant for something more. I just didn't know what that something was, or if I'd ever find it. As the months turned into years, my life remained a relentless grind. But the seeds of change were beginning to take root, even if I couldn't see them yet. The kitchen, with all its noise and chaos, was preparing me for something I could never have anticipated. And while I didn't know it yet, the next chapter of my life was about to begin. A chapter that would take me far from the kitchen and into a world I never thought I'd be part of. My alarm clock blares at 6 a.m. sharp, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet of my cramped studio apartment. The mornings are always the hardest, dragging my weary body out of bed, every muscle protesting the effort. The kitchen might have been my life, but it didn't care much for my comfort. I would glance at the pile of unpaid bills on the counter, then remind myself why I had to do this. Rent wasn't going to pay itself. By 7 a.m., I'm in the kitchen, my stained apron tied tight around my waist, setting up my station before the chaos begins. The air already hums with the low din of prep work, knives slicing through vegetables, and the soft hiss of burners coming to life. There's a strange rhythm to it, almost soothing in its predictability, but I'm not fooled. Soon enough, the orders will start pouring in, each one demanding precision and speed. 12 hours of this, sometimes more, was the norm, not the exception. I worked 280 hours a month, a figure I once thought I'd never tolerate. Yet, there I was, clocking in and out like a machine, pushing my body to its limits for a paycheck that barely covered the essentials. Rent, utilities, and groceries siphoned away most of it. Any leftovers were a rare indulgence, a cheap meal out, or a bottle of whiskey to numb the monotony. Overtime wasn't a bonus, it was survival. The physical toll of the job was relentless. My hands bore the marks of years in the kitchen, burn scars from careless moments with hot pans, calluses from endless chopping, and a dull ache that never quite went away. My legs throbbed by the end of every shift, a constant reminder of the hours spent standing on unforgiving tile floors. The kitchen heat was another beast entirely, enveloping me in a stifling embrace that left me drenched in sweat long before the lunch rush hit. But the mental strain was worse. The kitchen demanded perfection under pressure. A single mistake could unravel the entire operation. I'd seen it happen before. A wrong order sent out, a sauce burned on the stove, and the fallout was immediate. Tony, the head chef, was a tyrant when it came to errors, his voice rising above the cacophony to berate whoever was unlucky enough to slip up. "Focus, damn it," he'd yell, slamming a pan down for emphasis. I'd nod silently, gritting my teeth and returning to my station, vowing to avoid his wrath. Quitting wasn't an option. The kitchen might have been hell, but it was my hell, and I had nowhere else to go. Outside of work, life wasn't much better. My apartment was as uninspiring as my paycheck. A tiny, dimly lit space with peeling paint and a faucet that leaked no matter how many times I tried to fix it. The fridge rattled incessantly, a ghostly echo of the hum I endured at work. Days off were a rare luxury, and when they came, I spent them recovering. My body demanded rest, but my mind never seemed to find peace. The streets of my town mirrored my own stagnation. It was a place where ambition went to die, a patchwork of aging storefronts and dimly lit bars. On the rare nights I ventured out, I'd find myself sitting at a corner table nursing a drink, watching other people live lives I couldn't imagine. Vacations, promotions, new opportunities. These were concepts that seemed alien to me, distant and unattainable. In those moments, I felt the weight of my insignificance. The world moved on, but I stayed the same, tethered to a kitchen that consumed all my time and energy. I envied those who could dream of something better, but I also resented them. They didn't know what it was like to grind away month after month with no end in sight. They didn't know what it was like to be invisible. Still, I pushed forward. Routine became my lifeline, a way to anchor myself amidst the chaos. The kitchen had its own rhythm, one that I had mastered over the years. There was a certain pride in knowing that I could handle the pressure, that I could keep the machine running no matter how intense the heat or how heavy the workload. But pride didn't pay the bills, and it certainly didn't fill the void that grew deeper with every passing day. I'd sometimes catch myself staring out the tiny kitchen window, a brief glimpse of the world beyond. I'd wonder what it would be like to leave it all behind, to start over somewhere new. But those thoughts were fleeting, quickly smothered by the reality of my situation. I couldn't afford to dream. Dreams were for people who had options, and I didn't. Even so, there was a part of me that refused to give up entirely. It was buried deep, hidden beneath layers of exhaustion and resignation, but it was there. A quiet voice that whispered of possibilities, of a life beyond the kitchen. I didn't know how to reach it, and I wasn't sure I ever would. But it was enough to keep me going, to keep me putting one foot in front of the other. As I trudged through another endless shift, I couldn't have known that change was on the horizon. The kitchen, with all its noise and chaos, was preparing me for something I could never have anticipated. And though I didn't see it yet, the seeds of transformation were already being sown. My life was about to take a turn I never expected, one that would lead me far from the routines that had defined me for so long. It started innocently enough. After another grueling shift, I found myself at a dive bar nursing a cheap whiskey, the burn of the alcohol a brief reprieve from the weight of the day. The TV above the bar blared highlights from a basketball game, and the bartender muttered something about a bet he had lost. I wasn't paying much attention until a man sitting a few stools down chimed in, boasting about the small fortune he had won that week. "Just a few bucks here and there," he said, though his grin suggested otherwise. "It adds up if you know what you're doing." I'd heard about sports betting before, of course. Who hadn't? But up until that moment, it had been a distant concept, something other people did. My life had always been too rigid, too confined by the demands of work and survival, to entertain such distractions. Yet, as I sipped my drink and listened to the man's story, a strange curiosity began to stir. The following day, I couldn't shake the conversation from my mind. The idea of making money, real money, without sweating through another shift in the kitchen felt like a revelation. It wasn't about greed or ambition, not at first. It was about escape. The thought of having a cushion, even a small one, that might ease the constant pressure of bills and rent was intoxicating. That night, I found myself back at the bar, though this time I was more focused. The man from before was there again, regaling anyone who would listen with tales of his latest wins. I waited for a lull in his storytelling before asking him how it worked. His eyes lit up as he explained the basics: odds, spreads, over-unders. It sounded complicated at first, but the more he talked, the more it seemed like a game, one that I could learn to play. "Start small," he advised. "Don't bet more than you can afford to lose." The irony of that advice wasn't lost on me. What could I afford to lose? My margins were razor thin, but the allure was too strong to resist. On my next day off, I created an account on a betting site, depositing a modest sum of $50. It was more than I should have risked, but it felt like an investment, a chance to break the monotony. At first, I stuck to small bets, as the man had suggested. A few dollars on a basketball game, a modest wager on a football match. I pored over statistics and articles, trying to convince myself that I had an edge, that I wasn't just throwing money into the void. The rush of winning, even a few dollars, was unlike anything I'd felt in years. It was a spark, a jolt to my system that made the drudgery of the kitchen fade, if only for a moment. But losing was different. The first time I watched my carefully chosen bet fall apart, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. The money I'd lost wasn't much, but it stung in a way I hadn't expected. Still, I told myself it was part of the game. Losses were inevitable, and the key was to learn from them. I began to analyze my bets more meticulously, convinced that I could outsmart the odds with enough effort. The problem was, the kitchen didn't leave much time for effort. My shifts consumed most of my waking hours, and by the time I stumbled home, I was too exhausted to do anything but place impulsive bets. I told myself it was harmless, that it was just a way to unwind. But I could feel something shifting, a subtle but insistent pull that kept me returning to the app, chasing the high of a win. As the weeks went on, my wagers grew bolder. What had started as $5 bets crept up to $10, then $20. I rationalized it as progress, a sign that I was getting better, that I could afford to take bigger risks. The truth, though, was that I was losing more often than I was winning. The small victories weren't enough to offset the mounting losses, and my modest initial deposit began to dwindle. By the end of the month, I had burned through $200, money I couldn't afford to lose. It wasn't a catastrophic amount, not yet, but it was enough to make me question what I was doing. I tried to step back, to put the app away and focus on my work, but the thought of betting lingered like an itch I couldn't scratch. The kitchen felt more suffocating than ever, the weight of my routine pressing down with renewed force. One evening, as I scrubbed a particularly stubborn pot, I caught myself daydreaming about a big win. I imagined the rush of seeing my account balance surge, of having enough money to cover my bills and then some. The thought was intoxicating, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was on the cusp of something bigger. Maybe, just maybe, betting wasn't a distraction. Maybe it was my way out. Looking back, I can see how naive I was, how easily I let myself believe in the illusion of control. But at the time, it felt like hope, a flicker of possibility in an otherwise bleak existence. I wasn't just chasing money. I was chasing freedom, the chance to break free from the grind and reclaim a piece of myself that I'd long since lost. I didn't know it then, but the game was already playing me, and the stakes were about to get much higher. The spiral began slowly, as these things often do. At first, I managed to convince myself that I was still in control. The losses stung, but the occasional win kept me hooked, fueling the belief that I could turn things around. The betting app on my phone became a constant companion, a source of both excitement and dread. I found myself checking it obsessively, scanning the odds, searching for the perfect wager that would tip the scales in my favor. By now, the thrill of winning had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the rush, the fleeting moment when I felt like I had outsmarted the system, like I had beaten the odds. But those moments were rare. More often than not, I found myself staring at a dwindling balance, my chest tightening with regret and frustration. I started chasing losses, a term I hadn't known existed but now understood all too well. If I lost $20 on a basketball game, I'd immediately place another bet to try to win it back. If that bet failed, I'd double down again, convinced that the next wager would be the one to restore my balance. It never was. The losses piled up, each one compounding the weight of my financial strain. My work began to suffer. The kitchen, once a place of routine and familiarity, started to feel like a prison. I'd spend entire shifts thinking about my bets, my mind wandering as I chopped vegetables or stirred sauces. The head chef, Tony, noticed my lack of focus and didn't hesitate to call me out. "What the hell is wrong with you today?" he barked during a particularly busy lunch rush. I mumbled an apology, but his words lingered. The truth was, I wasn't sure what was wrong with me. I only knew that I felt trapped, caught between the grind of the kitchen and the increasingly toxic pull of the bets. By the end of the month, I'd burned through another $500. My savings, modest as they were, had been all but depleted. The bills were piling up, and I was struggling to keep my head above water. I tried to hide the extent of my losses, even from myself, rationalizing each bad decision as part of the learning curve. But deep down, I knew I was in trouble. I'd started borrowing money from friends, small amounts at first, always with the promise to pay them back as soon as I hit it big. Of course, that day never came. My debts grew, and so did the lies I told to cover them. It was a vicious cycle, one that seemed impossible to break. One evening, after another crushing loss, I found myself walking aimlessly through the streets of my town. The neon lights of bars and liquor stores glowed like beacons, but I didn't stop. I couldn't face the noise, the crowds, the reminders of how far I'd fallen. Instead, I wandered to the edge of town, where the streets grew quieter and the buildings gave way to open fields. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring out at the darkness, trying to make sense of what my life had become. I thought about my parents, about the sacrifices they'd made to give me a better life, about how disappointed they'd be if they knew what I'd done. I thought about the kitchen, the endless hours I'd poured into a job that never seemed to give anything back. And I thought about the bets, the seductive promise of escape that had turned into a trap of its own making. It was in that moment of quiet despair that a new thought began to take shape. If I was going to gamble, I needed to do it differently. The small, scattered bets weren't working. They were just bleeding me dry, one loss at a time. If I was going to win, really win, I needed to go bigger. It was a dangerous idea, one that I knew could backfire spectacularly. But I was desperate, and desperation has a way of silencing reason. The next day, I took what little money I had left and placed a single, high-stakes bet. It was reckless, a Hail Mary that I knew could either save me or destroy me. I spent the entire day in a state of agonized anticipation, my mind racing with what-ifs. When the result finally came through, my heart stopped. I had won. Not just a small victory, but a massive one. My account balance surged, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The rush was indescribable. In that moment, all the losses, all the pain and regret seemed to fade away. I had done it. I had beaten the odds. I had found my way out. Or so I thought. What I didn't realize was that this win, this fleeting moment of triumph, was just another step down the path I couldn't see was leading to ruin. Winning that large bet was like lighting a fuse. For the first time in what felt like years, I tasted the intoxicating rush of possibility. My account balance had swelled to a number I'd never imagined seeing. It wasn't just money. It was validation, proof that I could rise above the grind of the kitchen and the suffocating monotony of my life. In the days that followed, I reveled in my newfound fortune. The pressure that had hung over me like a storm cloud began to lift. I paid off a few bills, bought myself a new pair of shoes, and even treated myself to a night out at a nicer bar than usual. For a brief moment, I felt untouchable, but something in me had shifted. The thrill of that big win wasn't just a memory, it was a craving. I tasted victory, and I wanted more. The idea of going back to small, cautious bets felt absurd. Why waste my time nickel-and-diming when I could hit it big again? I convinced myself that I had cracked the code, that my win wasn't luck but skill. And so, I doubled down. At first, it worked. My confidence grew with each successful bet, and my balance climbed even higher. The numbers on the screen began to feel less real, more like points in a game than the money I had once sweated for in the kitchen. I started making larger wagers, throwing down hundreds of dollars on games I barely understood. And for a while, I kept winning. I couldn't help but notice how different I felt during this time. For years, my life had been defined by scarcity, counting every penny, dreading every bill, resigning myself to the drudgery of 12-hour shifts. But now, for the first time, I felt in control. I felt powerful. The kitchen, with its endless noise and demands, no longer felt like my prison. It was just a stepping stone, a temporary stop on my journey to something greater. I started to indulge in small luxuries. A new phone to replace my cracked and outdated one. Dinners at restaurants where I didn't have to cook or clean. Even a weekend getaway to a nearby city, where I splurged on a hotel room with a view. These were things I had always considered out of reach, and now they were mine. But winning wasn't enough. The more I gambled, the more I realized that the thrill didn't come from the money itself. It came from the risk. Each bet was a gamble not just of dollars, but of my sense of self-worth. The stakes had to keep rising, or the rush would fade. I started chasing bigger and bigger wins, placing bets that made even my newly inflated balance look precarious. Then came the losses. At first, they were small, just blips on an otherwise upward trajectory. I brushed them off, convinced that they were temporary setbacks. It's just part of the game, I told myself. But the losses began to compound, each one eroding my confidence a little more. My balance, once a source of pride, started to shrink. The high of winning was replaced by the gnawing anxiety of trying to recover what I had lost. I'd spend hours agonizing over my bets, poring over stats and analysis, trying to convince myself that I was making informed decisions. But deep down, I knew that luck played a far greater role than I cared to admit. Every time I hit place bet, I felt a pang of dread, a small voice whispering that I was on borrowed time. The turning point came one night when I placed a particularly large bet on a basketball game. It was a long shot, but the payout would have been enormous. I watched the game with bated breath, every play feeling like life or death. When the final buzzer sounded and my team lost, it felt like a punch to the gut. I stared at the screen, unable to process what had just happened. In an instant, I had wiped out nearly half of my balance. The rational part of me knew I should stop. I should take what I had left and walk away, use it to pay off my debts or invest in something stable. But the gambler in me refused to listen. I was too close, I told myself. One more win, and I'd be back on top. The thought of quitting felt like admitting defeat, and I couldn't bear the idea of going back to the life I'd been so desperate to escape. So I kept going. Each loss only fueled my determination to win it all back. I began to ignore the red flags, the warning signs that I was spiraling out of control. My bets grew riskier, my wins fewer and farther between. The balance that had once felt limitless was now a constant reminder of my failures. By the end of the month, the numbers on the screen were unrecognizable. The fortune I had once celebrated was gone, reduced to a fraction of its former glory. I was back where I started, only now I had tasted what it was like to win, to feel like something more than a cog in the kitchen machine. And that taste made the loss all the more bitter. The kitchen loomed over me again, its demands as relentless as ever. But now, there was a new weight on my shoulders, a burden I had created for myself. I had gambled not just with my money but with my future, and the cost was starting to catch up with me. The numbers on my betting account were growing harder to comprehend. I stopped thinking of them as dollars and started seeing them as opportunities. Doors that could open to a life I had only dreamed of. But to open those doors, I had to push harder. My wagers grew bolder, my confidence teetering on the edge of recklessness. Each night became a marathon of bets. I'd sit in my dimly lit apartment, my phone glowing with the promise of untold riches. Basketball, soccer, tennis, it didn't matter. If it had odds, I would bet on it. I told myself I was diversifying, spreading my risks, but in truth, I was just chasing the next thrill. Every bet felt like a knife's edge, the stakes higher than ever. There were nights when I gambled away more in an hour than I made in a week at the kitchen. The sheer volume of my wagers was staggering. I'd stack bets on top of bets, convinced that one big win could erase the mounting losses. And then it happened. A string of victories so improbable that it felt like the universe itself had taken my side. It started with a long-shot soccer match. The odds were abysmal, but the payout was enticing, the kind of money that could change everything. I watched the game in a state of near paralysis, every goal or near miss sending my heart into overdrive. For most of the match, it looked like I was doomed. The underdog team I'd bet on was down 2 goals with less than 15 minutes to go. But then, against all logic, they mounted a comeback. A penalty kick, a deflection, a desperate last-minute strike. When the final whistle blew, I was staring at a balance so massive it hardly seemed real. I threw my hands in the air, shouting into the emptiness of my apartment. The rush was indescribable, a mix of relief, euphoria, and disbelief. I had done it. I had beaten the odds, snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. But even in that moment of triumph, there was a shadow of doubt. I couldn't shake the memory of how close I had come to losing everything. Instead of walking away, I leaned in further. The next night, I placed an even larger bet, this time on a basketball game. The stakes were astronomical, the kind of wager that could elevate me to a level I'd never imagined. But the game was a nail-biter from start to finish. My team trailed for most of the match, their performance riddled with turnovers and missed opportunities. By the fourth quarter, I was pacing my apartment, my hands trembling with every play. With seconds left on the clock, the score was tied. My fate hung in the balance of a single possession. My team's star player drove to the basket, the defenders closing in. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked like he would miss. But then, at the last possible second, the ball left his hands and swished through the net. The buzzer sounded, and I collapsed onto my couch, shaking with a mix of relief and exhilaration. I had won again, but just barely. The close calls began to pile up. Each victory felt like a narrow escape, the thrill amplified by the ever-present risk of losing it all. I started to believe I was invincible, that I had some innate ability to ride the line between luck and disaster. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was playing with fire, and it was only a matter of time before I got burned. My balance swelled to heights I'd never thought possible. Thousands of dollars stared back at me from the screen. A fortune that could have wiped away my debts, transformed my life. But I didn't withdraw a single cent. The money felt safer in the game than in my hands, a tool to fuel the next gamble. I was no longer betting to win. I was betting to feel alive. The highs were extraordinary, but the lows were devastating. Each near loss chipped away at my confidence, a constant reminder of how precarious my situation had become. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the bets. The kitchen became an afterthought, a dull background noise to the chaos consuming my life. My coworkers noticed the change, but I brushed off their concerns with hollow reassurances. The spiral continued, each bet a new gamble of extremes. I placed wagers on obscure sports I barely understood, desperate to keep the momentum going. Cricket matches in distant countries, underdog teams in minor leagues, it didn't matter. The thrill was the same, the stakes always teetering on the edge of disaster. And yet, somehow, I kept winning. But the close calls haunted me. I began to see patterns where there were none, convinced that I could predict the unpredictable. I spent hours analyzing stats, searching for the perfect formula to guarantee success. But the more I tried to control the chaos, the more it seemed to slip through my fingers. The game had taken on a life of its own, a force I couldn't escape. Looking back, I can see how reckless I had become, how blind I was to the danger I was courting. But in the moment, all I could see was the next bet, the next win, the next chance to defy the odds. I was living on the edge, a gambler in the truest sense, driven by the thrill of a game I couldn't possibly win forever. I still don't know what kept me going during those weeks. My body was worn down from long shifts in the kitchen and sleepless nights glued to my phone, but my mind was consumed by a singular obsession: the next big win. Every waking moment revolved around gambling. At work, I daydreamed about bets I would place. At home, I devoured stats and highlights, trying to build a foolproof system. I told myself I was close, so close to something monumental. And then it happened. The bet that changed everything wasn't a calculated move. It was an act of desperation, a last-ditch effort to recover from another devastating loss. I'd wagered almost everything on a single game, a European soccer final that everyone said was too close to call. The odds were tight, the stakes enormous. I could barely breathe as the match unfolded. For most of the game, it looked like I had made a catastrophic mistake. My team was sluggish, outplayed at every turn. By halftime, they were down by 2 goals, and I felt the walls closing in. I wanted to turn off the screen, to walk away and pretend it wasn't happening. But I couldn't. I was glued to the screen, my heart pounding with every pass, every shot. Then, as if by some miracle, the momentum shifted. A substitution brought fresh energy to the field, and within minutes, my team scored their first goal. I sat up, my pulse racing. Another goal followed soon after, a brilliant strike that tied the game. By the time extra time began, I was on my feet, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. The winning goal came in the final moments, a header off a corner kick that seemed to hang in the air forever before finding the back of the net. I didn't even cheer. I just stared at the screen, stunned, as the reality of what had happened began to sink in. My balance had skyrocketed to an unimaginable number. I was no longer just a guy working 280 hours a month in a kitchen. I was rich. The first thing I did was withdraw a portion of my winnings. I told myself it was a safety net, a buffer to ensure I wouldn't lose everything. But the rest, the bulk of it, stayed in the game. It wasn't just money to me anymore. It was power, potential. I felt unstoppable. Over the next few weeks, my life transformed in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I paid off every debt, something that had once seemed impossible. I walked into work with a confidence that turned heads, a swagger that even Tony, the tyrannical head chef, couldn't ignore. When he barked at me to move faster, I smirked and told him I didn't need this job anymore. "What's that supposed to mean?" he snapped. "It means I'm done," I said, pulling off my apron and tossing it onto the counter. The look on his face was priceless. For years, he had lorded over me, treating me like I was nothing. Now, I was walking out on my terms. The days that followed felt like a dream. I rented a suite in the nicest hotel in town, a place I'd only ever seen in passing. The room was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. I spent my mornings ordering room service and my nights at exclusive bars and clubs, places where the drinks cost more than my old weekly grocery budget. For the first time in my life, I felt free. But the freedom came with its own set of temptations. The money was a magnet, drawing in people and experiences I'd never had access to before. Strangers became fast friends, eager to join me on nights filled with champagne and laughter. Women who wouldn't have spared me a second glance were suddenly at my side, their smiles as intoxicating as the expensive liquor we drank. I knew they weren't there for me. Not really. They were there for the money, the lifestyle. But I didn't care. I basked in the attention, the validation. Still, the bets didn't stop. If anything, they grew larger, more extravagant. Winning that fortune had only fed my addiction, convincing me that I could defy the odds indefinitely. I started betting on everything: sports, horse races, even online poker games. The stakes were astronomical, the risks dizzying. But I couldn't stop. The thrill was too addictive, the lure of doubling my fortune too strong. And then came the night that should have been my undoing. It was a basketball game, one of the biggest of the season. I had wagered nearly half of my remaining fortune on the outcome, convinced that I had an edge. The game was a disaster. My team was losing badly, their star player benched with an injury. By the fourth quarter, I was staring at the screen in disbelief, my hands trembling as the numbers on my account threatened to plummet. But somehow, against all odds, they turned it around. A series of improbable three-pointers, a last-minute defensive play, and a buzzer beater that left the crowd roaring. My account balance soared once again, and I collapsed onto the couch, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I had won. Barely. It was a wake-up call, or at least it should have been. The close calls were becoming too frequent, the risks too great. But in that moment, all I could think about was the high, the rush of knowing I had escaped disaster once again. I was riding a wave that felt unstoppable, oblivious to the storm gathering on the horizon. My life had transformed beyond recognition. Just weeks before, I was toiling away in a kitchen, invisible and exhausted. Now, I was living the kind of life I had only seen in movies or heard about in the exaggerated stories of bar patrons. The money had opened doors I never even knew existed, and I threw myself through them without hesitation. I moved into a penthouse apartment overlooking the city, a place so opulent it felt like I was visiting someone else's dream. Marble countertops, sleek modern furniture, and a balcony that stretched out into the skyline. It was the kind of place that whispered wealth and power, and I soaked it all in. I spent hours on that balcony, sipping imported whiskey and looking down at the city that had once swallowed me whole. Now, it felt like it was mine. Everything about my life became larger, louder, more extravagant. I bought clothes that felt like armor, designer suits tailored to perfection. My wardrobe transformed me from a tired cook into a man of means, someone who belonged in the upscale bars and exclusive clubs I now frequented. People noticed. Strangers greeted me like I was someone important, their eyes lighting up when I entered the room. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. The days became a blur of indulgence. Mornings started with gourmet breakfasts delivered to my door, Meals that made the food I used to prepare in the kitchen seem laughable. Afternoons were spent shopping or at high-end spas, where attendants fussed over me like I was royalty. And the nights? The nights were wild. Lavish parties, private lounges, endless champagne. It was intoxicating. The constant swirl of music, laughter, and attention. Women flocked to me, drawn by the confidence that the money had given me and the allure of the lifestyle I now embodied. They were beautiful, glamorous, and completely unlike anyone I'd ever known. I told myself I deserved it, the attention, the affection. After years of being overlooked, I felt like I had finally arrived. But with all the luxury came recklessness. The money felt limitless, a fountain that would never run dry. I began spending with abandon, splurging on things I didn't need but couldn't resist. A custom sports car that turned heads wherever I went. Jewelry that sparkled like stars under the dim lights of upscale clubs. Nights out where I covered the tab for everyone, basking in their gratitude and admiration. The gambling, however, remained the center of it all. If my spending was reckless, my betting was downright absurd. The stakes kept climbing, the numbers on my screen reaching dizzying heights. I placed bets that could have bought houses, confident that I was untouchable. And more often than not, I won. The rush of those wins was unlike anything else, a euphoric high that no amount of money or attention could replicate. But not every bet was a victory. The losses were just as massive, and they cut deeper than ever before. Each one felt like a crack in the foundation I had built, a reminder of how precarious my newfound life really was. But instead of pulling back, I pushed harder. I told myself that I could make it back, that I could climb even higher. The fear of losing it all was overshadowed by the thrill of the game. My world became a whirlwind of extremes. One day, I was celebrating a seven-figure win, popping champagne in a private lounge with people whose names I barely knew. The next, I was staring at my screen in stunned silence, watching as a poorly placed bet wiped out half of my balance. The highs were exhilarating, the lows devastating, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to. There were moments when I caught glimpses of my old life, fleeting reminders of who I had been before all of this. I'd pass by a restaurant and see the kitchen staff rushing around, their faces tired but determined. I'd think about the hours I'd spent behind those doors, the heat, the noise, the grind. It felt like another lifetime, a reality that no longer belonged to me. And yet, there was a part of me that missed it. The simplicity, the sense of purpose, the camaraderie. But those thoughts never lingered. They were quickly drowned out by the allure of my new existence. The money, the power, the attention. It was all-consuming. I had climbed higher than I'd ever thought possible, but I was too caught up in the climb to see how thin the air was getting. My life had become a balancing act, one misstep away from catastrophe. But at the time, I didn't care. I was king of my world, and nothing else mattered. The beginning of the end wasn't marked by any single moment. It was a series of small, subtle shifts, each one dragging me closer to the edge. I didn't see it at the time, or maybe I just refused to, but the cracks in my perfect world were growing wider with every passing day. The money, once a symbol of my freedom, had become a burden. My extravagant spending habits were impossible to sustain, and the losses from my increasingly reckless bets began to pile up. I told myself it was temporary, that I could turn it around with one big win. But the numbers didn't lie. My balance, which had once felt limitless, was shrinking at an alarming rate. I started to cut corners in ways I never thought I would. I skipped payments on my credit cards, let bills go overdue, and borrowed money from friends under the guise of temporary setbacks. It was a strange irony. For all the wealth I had once flaunted, I was now scrambling to stay afloat. My penthouse, my car, my lifestyle, they all felt like a house of cards, ready to collapse with the slightest gust of wind. The turning point came during a poker game, one I had been invited to by a group of high-rolling acquaintances. It was an exclusive event held in a private suite at a luxury hotel. The buy-in was astronomical, but the potential payout was even higher. I convinced myself it was worth the risk, that this was my chance to reclaim what I had lost and then some. The game was intense, the stakes higher than anything I'd ever experienced. I played well at first, my nerves steeled by the promise of victory. But as the night wore on, fatigue and desperation began to cloud my judgment. I made risky moves, overplayed my hand, and ignored the warning signs that I was in over my head. The other players, seasoned veterans of the game, saw right through me. They played me like a fiddle, chipping away at my stack with ruthless precision. By the final hand, I was all in. Everything I had left, the remnants of my fortune, the last shreds of my dignity, was on the line. My heart pounded as the cards were revealed. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I had won. But then the dealer's voice cut through the tension, declaring my opponent the winner. It was over. I sat there in stunned silence, the weight of my loss crashing down on me like a tidal wave. The other players offered polite condolences, their faces betraying none of the satisfaction they must have felt. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to blame someone else for my downfall. But deep down, I knew the truth. This was my doing. My choices, my arrogance, my addiction. The days that followed were a blur of shame and regret. I avoided calls from creditors, ignored messages from friends, and retreated into the shadows of my now empty apartment. The penthouse was gone, repossessed by the bank along with my car and everything else of value. The parties, the luxury, the adoration. It all vanished as quickly as it had come. I returned to the kitchen, not out of choice but necessity. The restaurant had hired someone to replace me after my dramatic exit, but they took me back out of pity or perhaps amusement. The work was the same, but I was different. The kitchen that had once felt suffocating now felt like a lifeline, a place where I could disappear into the monotony and avoid confronting the wreckage of my life. The worst part wasn't the loss of money or status. It was the realization that I had betrayed myself. I had become the person I used to scoff at, the one who thought they could outsmart the system and win big without consequences. I had climbed to the top of a mountain built on sand, only to watch it crumble beneath me. And yet, amidst the despair, there was a faint glimmer of hope. The kitchen, for all its flaws, was still there. The rhythm, the grind, the camaraderie, they were constants in a world that had proven to be anything but. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I couldn't keep running from myself. If I was going to rebuild, I had to start from the ground up. It's strange how life works. I started this journey in the kitchen, grinding through endless shifts, dreaming of something more. I clawed my way out, tasted success, and lost it all in a whirlwind of excess and poor decisions. The fall was brutal, but it taught me more than I ever expected. The truth is, I'd been searching for freedom, for control, for meaning in a life that felt stuck. Gambling gave me the illusion of those things, but it was just that, an illusion. The money, the luxury, the admiration, none of it could fill the void I carried inside. When it all came crashing down, I was left with nothing but the raw, unvarnished truth of who I'd become. Returning to the kitchen felt like failure at first, but it turned out to be my salvation. There, amidst the clang of pots and the rush of service, I found a strange kind of peace. The work was hard, the hours long, but it was real. It grounded me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I'm not the same person I was when this all began. The rise and fall changed me, stripped me of my illusions, and forced me to confront myself. I've learned to find satisfaction in small victories, to value stability over fleeting thrills. The kitchen, once a symbol of my limitations, has become a place of renewal. My story isn't glamorous, but it's mine. I've made peace with the choices that brought me here and the lessons they've taught me. Life is messy, unpredictable, and often unforgiving. But it's also full of second chances, and I'm determined to make the most of mine.